Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's watching. This is Middle East Insights, and I'm Dr. Shubhra Chaudhary. And I'm really very, very happy and privileged to welcome you today to our International Dialogue series, where we are welcoming Suhasini Haidar. She doesn't need any introduction, but she's a diplomatic editor for The Hindu. She is the host of Worldview with Suhasini Haidar, former Foreign Affairs editor, CNN IBN, former correspondent, CNN International. She covers South Asia, West Asia, or Middle East, and global diplomacy. She also got Prem Bhatia Award in 2015, Columbia DuPont Award for Tsunami Coverage in 2005, and she has spent more than 30 years in journalism. Can you imagine? So we are very, very lucky to have her, very fortunate to have her. And today she is going to speak about India's foreign policy in West Asia. And with this, ma'am, thank you so much for the privilege of your time and being ready for this conversation. My first question to you is that as we see the kind of evolution of governance in Syria, plus the minority clashes and what is happening in Suweda, what do you think, what is in India's foreign policy with the HTS regime as of now? And because we had a lot of ONGC, Videsh, and many other exploration investments in Syria during the Assad regime, he also came to India. So how will it tilt for India?
Well, to be honest, and I should really begin by saying thank you, Dr. Chaudhary, for having me on. I should make the point, especially to your students and your listeners, that journalists are not niche experts. We tend to look at more general situations, and we look at the world at large and how it affects India maybe more closely than we look at the situation itself. And that's perhaps one of the areas where experts and academics like you kind of really step in. Because we can talk about what's happening on the ground and what that means for India much more, but perhaps not as much about the intricacies of what's going on. The truth is that as far as Syria has gone, India has issued just a few very cautious statements. I think if you will remember that when it comes to Syria, when it comes to the sort of revolution or coup, as you'd like to see it, that ousted Assad, India issued a very, very cautious statement. And it has kept a kind of a balanced point of view. It has consistently made the kind of case it makes in a lot of these situations, called for a Syrian-led, run, inclusive political process. Even though the truth is that Bashar al-Assad was actually someone who India had a lot of dealings with and was able to work with. As you pointed out, ONG Videsh had a certain interest over there. We also saw Bashar al-Assad in particular speaking to India about the possibility of low-cost reconstruction. So there was always this idea that when the Syrian revolution ended, or when the Syrian violence ended, that India would have a big stake. Because of the past, of India's non-aligned past, of India's relationship with Arab nationalism, in a sense, in many of these countries like Iraq and Syria, and as well as the idea that India has now increased its outreach in terms of helping other countries with low-cost solutions. So there was a sense that, in a sense, the Assad regime, as it was, very brutal, was not inimical to India. And India had fought hard to keep that little space over there, even at the cost of upsetting the US at various times. And I'm talking in the previous decades, of course. In the last few years, it's been much, much less. They had a dwindling bilateral trade. But as I said, there was always this interest in, firstly, in MOUs in infrastructure and in energy. In fact, Syria is one of the few countries where India and China had a combined stake. in a Syrian oil company as well. So if there isn't stability, and let's put it this way, that even with Assad gone and al-Shara there, India has not in any way taken any sides there. With Assad gone and al-Shara now facing some of the violence, and you spoke about the violence in Suweda, violence between the Druze and government forces. Earlier, we saw the kind of massacre of Alawites. So this sense that the minorities in Syria that used to be part of the government, the Shias in particular, the Ismailis in particular, being affected. This lack of stabilization always has a spillover effect for India. There are not too many Indians in Syria at present, but there's always a worry about what it means for the broader region. And of course, the broader region, a place where India, there are close to 8-9 Indians living and working today.
Yeah. And the most interesting part was that on 29th of November, MEA had a meeting discussing what is going to happen in Syria. And then by 8th of December, Assad was gone.
They had a joint commission meeting.
Yeah. And the most interesting thing which I find is when Nehru visited Syria at least twice. So during that time, the Baath party leaders were very much inspired by the Indian freedom movement. Also, the kind of swords that the Syrians used during the time of Silk Route and Spice Route, the Booz steel was actually exported from India. So the intricacies of those connections are very deep rooted. And I don't know if how India has adopted the Afghan or communicating with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, if they can replicate the same in Syria.
Well, certainly India has much more at stake in Afghanistan. In Syria, what has happened over these years is that stake has really got whittled down. And let's be clear, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Libya, and whether it's Syria, when there is this kind of Western interventionism, and we talk about the greater geopolitical game being played out in Syria as well, wherever it has, we've seen this kind of regime change through violence or with external intervention, India has always been very wary, because this is then leads to other crises in a place. Either the growth of radicalization in Afghanistan, whatever the US did, in those 20 years, its decision to sign a deal with the Taliban and then pull out abruptly from Afghanistan led to a very unstable situation, which the Taliban benefited from. It can be said that Syria was not very different from that, in a sense, except the differences, the comparisons end there because you can't compare the two regimes that were there before that. So India has always been a little wary on this issue, because there's always a larger geopolitical game. In this one, there's also a extra-regional game, whether it is the role of Israel, Turkey, Iran, and other players in here, Lebanon at one point. It is something where it is easier for India at this moment to take a step back and say, we'll wait until there is a little more stability here.
Yeah, I agree. Especially when I think the biggest heartbreak that Jalani or Ahmad al-Sharra gave was to Reza Pahlavi, thinking that the model will be emulated and that regime change might happen in Iran. And he was like speaking from Maryland, and nothing happened as of now.
But there have been others. There have been, There's been Libya, there's been Iraq in a sense, which did not play out according to what many had hoped.
Yes. And talking about specifically coming to, since we are talking about the broader implications, the Iran-Israel or Israel-Iran conflict just ended. There were so many Indian students specifically from Qom and from other parts of Iran, many women scholars who were evacuated. We have stakes both in Iran and in Israel. So Iran opened its airspace for the evacuation during the conflict. In Israel, we have 85,000 Indian Jews in terms of ancestry, and the highest number of students, like 32,000 Indian students studying there and laborers working there and all of that. So what do you think? How difficult was it for India to navigate through the crisis?
Shubha, the fact is that for India, making a balance when it comes to its relationships in West Asia, or the Middle East, as the West likes to call it, has not been something new. India has always had to make very, very careful balances. So even before its the closening of ties with Israel. One always had to see how India dealt with the Arab world, how India dealt with Iran, how India dealt with US interests in the region as well. But there was always a sense that India had a historic relationship with the region. As you were pointing out, I didn't know about the swords in Syria. But the truth is that India has such old trading, cultural, educational exchanges with these countries that it's very hard for India to say, oh, here is where my tactical interests lie. And, the polarization that's easy in other parts of the world, it's just not easy for India. So if you look at India's interests, and I will put aside the rest of the Gulf, as I said, 8 to 9 million Indians living and working there. At one point, the Gulf was the source of more than 40% of India's energy requirements. We also see the Gulf as a huge source for Indian investment. So if you put aside those links and just look in silos at what happened with Iran and what happened with Israel, and in a sense, let's be honest, the Israeli attacks on Iran were part of a trifecta of Israeli attacks on what they saw as Iran's proxies, whether it was in Yemen, whether it was in Lebanon with the Hezbollah, or whether it was in Syria with the Assad regime. The idea that the Iranian regime would be hugely weakened if they were able to attack that trifecta. So when India had to look at this situation, and as you pointed out, there are workers and there are students in Israel, there are students in Iran as well. I think there was much more at stake, because there was not just the relationship India has with each of these countries. Of course, with Iran, the oil that India used to depend on, about 12% of its oil came from Iran. That has been shrunk to zero in the last few years because the previous Trump administration had threatened sanctions. So since 2017, 2018, India has really not been buying Iranian oil, but there has been a trade relationship. There is Chabahar port. This is a port that India has invested and plans to invest up to $2 billion. So we're looking again at a situation where India's interests are very closely linked with what happens in Iran, because Chabahar port is not just about India's relationship with Iran. It is about the larger game of being able to go around, circumvent Pakistan for India's trade to Afghanistan, Central Asia, all the way up to Russia, if you count the international North-South transport corridor. So that's the situation with Iran. With Israel as well, there is the bilateral. There is the huge amount of military hardware and ammunition that India depends on Israel for. There's technology support. There are other ways in which India and Israel are cooperating. And then there are the multilateral places where India, Israel, UAE, US had one I2U2 combined. Then there is the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that goes through Haifa. So requires also India and Israel. So there's a connectivity project there. So there are bilateral ties, there are connectivity and geostrategic ties, and then there are what you were referring to, the people-to-people ties. I think it has almost become, we're living in an era now of consistent turbulence. And if you just look at the last 5 years, the third decade of the 21st century, from 2020 to 2025, look at the number of ways in which the world has changed, the turbulence that has required India to evacuate Indians from so many parts of the world. It seems like a lot now. Of course, in the past also, we had seen the Kuwait evacuation. There was the evacuation from Libya. There was in 2011, there was the evacuation from Lebanon in 2006. So it's not as if these things have not happened before. but it's in very quick succession that we're seeing them. So I think New Delhi has almost got an SOP, if you like, when this kind of situation breaks out, whether it was in Syria, whether it was with Israel and Iran. The first idea is to secure the Indian nationals in those countries. Once they're able to do that, then you can think about whether there are other Indian interests apart from the people that one has to speak about, and then move on to perhaps other areas where India plays a larger role, whether it's at the United Nations or whether it's at other places. I think in this particular case, we also saw relations being made, because a lot of this was a public relations. It was about the optics. We saw both Iran and Israel really trying to make a sort of public move also to gain support from various countries. So we saw, the kind of support Indians got in both of these countries. Iran actually, without a ceasefire with Israel, Iran unilaterally announced that it would open up its airspace just to allow flights carrying Indian students out of there, because it was becoming so difficult for them to get to the borders and then to fly out of neighboring countries. And India didn't particularly want to have them coming over from Turkey or Azerbaijan, given the kind of tensions we'd had after Operation Sindoor. So Iran made that special gesture just for India. Other countries were not given that gesture, even though China, others had a lot of evacuation programs. With Israel too, we saw the Israeli government trying to make plans to evacuate Indians from there. There was at one point even a plan to have them go out of Ashdod or Haifa port on cruise liners, but eventually they were able to take them all out at that time from Egypt or from Syria. And so we have seen bilateral relations, multilateral relations, and then, as I said, these geostrategic relations come into play each time India has had to deal with it. Where India has perhaps ended up, shall I say, disappointing both sides, is in the idea that it is not going to take a position beyond saying that dialogue and diplomacy is the only way forward. I think when it comes to West Asia, each of these countries believes they have a special relationship with India, and therefore had expected, perhaps, Israel had perhaps expected India not to issue statements on the situation in Gaza. For example, Iran had expected India to issue a much stronger statement in support of Iran, which had been attacked by Israel and then been attacked by the US, and particularly because the attacks had been on nuclear installations, which India has always had a very strong position on. And yet we saw India not taking part in the SCO's statement, and not supporting Iran there. And equally, others in West Asia have also expressed their disappointment that India is not taking a more proactive stand, because perhaps in the past India was seen as a sort of moral force. But I think the times have changed, and there is a sense now that the kind of turbulence we're seeing, India is better off being safe rather than sorry.
I do agree with you. But one thing which I don't understand, and this question is often posed to India in terms of the anti-India campaigning that often goes in the Arab media, and we are not much aware of it. But our multi-vector engagement policy, which is being followed by a lot of European countries in their own conflicting neighborhoods. I don't know why is India asked these questions and not Jordan, which is just the neighbor? Why is India asked these questions when the other, like Egypt is not asked those questions? What I don't understand is that, for example, what I heard was like European Union, for example, after a Pahalgam terrorist attack, did make a statement, though in closed circles, that kind of, like, you did not support us when it came to Ukraine, so why should we return the favor? Why should we give so much of importance to Operation Sindoor? So that kind of very transactional international politics be it in the Arab world or be it in the European Union, that is something which I don't understand because they themselves are playing that card.
We live in polarized times. So I will say that everyone has a different view depending on where they sit in any situation. And therefore, and people are changing their position. So therefore, Mr. Trump, who 6 months ago was telling us he had no problem with anyone dealing with Russia, is today telling us 500% tariffs if you continue to buy oil from Russia. So there is, there is this ability in the international sphere to not be consistent, to not necessarily care about anyone else's interests, to purely worry about what one's own interests are. But I will say over there that there is a cost to leadership. Yeah. And that cost is that you cannot only speak for yourself. You have to, somewhere there, speak for the greater good. Now, I'm not necessarily saying our choices should have been different. But I do feel that India has been seen as a country that stands for principle and does not make its positions just on the basis of, as you said, this transaction or on the basis of alignments. After all, India's foreign policy has been based on the idea that India does not ally with blocs. And despite what India's position in the Cold War may have been, was actually a leader of the non-aligned movement. With this in mind, there are those who would say that, for example, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was a place where India could have found it possible to make its own criticisms of that invasion without necessarily hurting the bilateral relationship with Russia in a very significant way, because other countries did it. Indonesia did it, Turkey did it, others had been critical while also trying to help find a solution. On two specific issues of principle, that was the threat to Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear installations, the nuclear power installations in Ukraine, and on the need for humanitarian corridors, India abstained. And there was a sense that India was now not taking a position out of principle, but out of saying, I will abstain no matter what. I will not be seen as critical. And that is something, as you pointed out, for the Western world that had built its own very extreme narrative over the Russia-Ukraine situation. It seemed impossible. When it comes to the Middle East, I think you're correct that there is an unfair double standard applied to India that is not applied to the West Asian countries themselves. But at least on these issues where India has abstained, many of these countries have actually gone out and said much more about the situation in Gaza, for example. And you can see that on a day-to-day basis, that situation is deteriorating, getting worse. We're looking at a situation of malnourishment, turning to starvation, turning to food riots, turning to people being fired on when they go to collect food. The kind of atrocities we have seen from the Israeli side on the people of Gaza in the last few months has become a little difficult to ignore, and yet India's statements have been very anodyne compared to anything else. One might say the words don't actually matter. Eventually, India is a country that has been known to help all of these situations. India's aid to Palestine has not ended. India's aid to UNRWA, for example, an organization that Israel calls a terror organization, has not ended either. India has not yet actually named Hamas as a terror organization even. So you could say that the words don't matter as much. India has stood for principle in other places, but I think this idea of disappointment comes not so much from a kind of anti-India feeling. What you were saying, it comes from a sort of disappointment because of India's position as a leader not just of the global South, but a leader of the non-aligned world. It's a huge responsibility in a sense. It may be unfair. It may be based on a previous era in the world that doesn't exist today. but it does exist, and there is that expectation from India.
And turning to the elephant in the room, which is how do you understand India's diplomatic ties with Palestine and Israel? For example, we had an interview with the UNRWA director in Ramallah, and he said that there's an 800-year-old, which was a Sufi sarai,
That's right.
which was created by an Indian, yeah. And then it has been converted into a refugee or rehabilitation center by UNRWA. And it has a history of 800 years, the India connection with Palestine, which goes even beyond it. At the same time, when there's so much of massive BDS campaign going around, there's a genocide that is going around. There's even the fintech corporations like PayPal and GoFundMe, they take the money, but they do not give it to the Palestinians. There's the settler occupation, which makes money out of the business pursuits of it. From a humanitarian angle, at every level, it is egregious and difficult to process as a human being, especially because it is live streamed throughout for more than 20 months. At the same time, we also invested in the Haifa port. Just 3-4 kilometers away, there's the Haifa Bay port operated by the Chinese. We have strong relations with Israel when it comes to intelligence or technology or water harvesting, agriculture, resource mobilization, scientific studies, and so much more. Also, the fact that the very beginning of the reason why there was a bit of criticism that went around in 1980s was because when Bangladesh was formed, Israel recognized it in 1972. The Arab countries recognized it in 1974. The same kind of empathy that we have for the Palestinian refugees or the refugee crisis as humans, individual humans, that is not replicated by most of the Arabs when it comes to India's partition. Not only 1947, but also 71. So the question was that why should we care so much when that same lens is not inverted to us?
I think this kind of thinking comes from an idea that somehow our relationship with every country in that region is some kind of it's a kind of combined relationship. Let's be very clear with each of these countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's the United Arab Emirates, whether it is Bahrain or Oman or Qatar or any of the countries in that region, India has its own direct bilateral relationship that has existed for centuries, or at least, with the modern Arab states ever since their creation. So the idea that we must see them as one block is a problem.
Yeah.
The second problem that arises is often because all of them are members of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. They're all part of a grouping that is based on religion. We tend to think that is then their position. That is as wrong and mistaken as it would be to say because India is part of SCO or because India is part of BRICS, that it is anti-US. That does not actually follow. We unfortunately have conflated the idea of religion and state in a way in the last few years, where we had been able to separate in the past. So even our outreach to the OIC it makes no sense for a country like India that is a secular country. The problem is not one of religion. Neither is it within the Israel-Palestinian equation, neither is it between the Arab countries and India. the problem is not about religion. And when it comes to geopolitical issues, I mean, look around the world, look at the kind of alliances that have come. They have nothing to do with religion. If religion was a factor, then Saudi Arabia, which saw itself as the leader of the Muslim world, would not have been as close to the United States as it was, and the US, and then vice versa. So I think there has to be a certain amount of realpolitik in this. There has to be a certain amount of understanding that this is not about religion, that it is essentially about India's relationships with each of these countries. And if we believe that all these countries are defined just by the positions that are taken at an organization which India should not actually even recognize, given that it is based on religion. It's an organization that accepts the fact that countries of around the world, people of one faith, should belong to one particular organization, which is actually a geopolitical organization, which is not something India subscribes to. The reason I'm saying all of this is because I think we have to understand each of our policies. When we talk about how these countries reacted when it came to Operation Sindoor, then we must remember that even closer friends of India that had nothing to do with these groupings did not provide the kind of support that India had hoped for when it came to Operation Sindoor. There's China, on one side, that is not a religious country. There is the United States on another side, where the president was, equivocating almost and saying, "I do trade with you, I do trade with you," was countering India's narrative on how the ceasefire was brought about, was giving lunch to the chief of the army in Pakistan, whom India believes, had in a sense incited this particular terror attack. So I think one has to, separate some of these emotions that come about with the idea that this is somehow connected to religion. Then you had asked about India's particular relationship with Israel and its relationship with Palestine. There's no question. Mahatma Gandhi was against the creation of Israel. I mean, that's a fact. It's something he's written about. However, India did eventually recognize Israel, even though it did not set up full diplomatic relations with Israel until 1992. India did, in fact, have a kind of, there was a business and trade relationship with Israel at that time. But there was no question that India's support for the Palestinian movement and support for an independent state for Palestine has consistently been there. India was the first non-Arab country to recognize, the demand for the Palestinian state. What has India's policy been in just the last few years? Just take a look at the kind of balance India has run. I was talking about, there's zero tolerance for terror. India has called for the release of hostages after October 7th, but it has not designated Hamas as a terror organization. It's called it a terror attack, but it hasn't designated the organization. It has said humanitarian law must prevail in the response of any country to a terror attack, and perhaps is uncomfortable with the rising civilian casualties, but it hasn't voted for a ceasefire. For example, in a number of occasions, India has not voted calling for a ceasefire from Israel. In terms of the Israeli settlements, India has always been very critical of Israeli settlements at the United Nations, but it does not support what you were talking about, the BDS campaign or the boycotts or sanctions of Israel over it. And as I said, India has increased its support for UNRWA, that Israel accuses of having helped the October 7th attacks. So I think you have to recognize that there's a lot more nuance to India's position, and it cannot just be brought down to any kind of state versus state or religious binaries, or what did we do for you versus what did you do for us, because I think India sees its relations with this part of the world as a much more complex kind of structure.
Thank you so much for going into all those nuances, and I'm going to use them when I, give India's position at different platforms, because the problem is that the Arab press specifically, the sentiment that has been created so far is quite difficult to just consume. And that
No,
is,
I want to tell you, in fact, that when our members of parliament went to the Arab world after Operation Sindoor to speak about what India's position on terrorism and cross-border terrorism was, I'm told quite reliably that they were asked in each of these stops, why is India silent on what Israel is doing in Gaza? And they responded and said, we are wondering why all of you are so silent on what is happening in Gaza as well.
yeah,
Even just 2 weeks ago, if you remember, France and Saudi Arabia had planned a conference at the United Nations to talk about statehood for Palestine.
yeah.
And Mr. Trump had been very upset with it, and the US had said anyone who's going to that conference, we will take action against them and all the rest. And what was the next thing France and Saudi Arabia did? They put off the conference indefinitely. So this idea that others are standing up, and this expectation, as you said, from India, it does not really bear out.
Yeah, because most of the Arab, like there's a difference between the Arab state and the Arab people or the Arab street. But the most interesting thing is that most of them have tacit alliances with Israel. Most of them.
Well, certainly the Abraham Accords showed that
Yeah.
it's possible to go ahead. Nobody has walked out of the I2U2. The UAE hasn't walked out of the I2U2. Saudi Arabia has now said it will not consider joining, recognizing Israel and having relations with Israel unless there is recognition for a Palestinian state. But there's no question that the talks continue. Let's remember that the talks have continued with Qatar. They have continued with a number of countries over there without necessarily this idea that, without necessarily saying that we cannot have any conversation. Jordan has not walked away from its relationship. The UAE has not canceled the Abraham Accords. Neither have any of the other countries. So,
Yeah, so that is the hypocrisy which we don't really, I personally don't understand it because I find it very, I do also take into cognizance the anger and the voices that are stemming in the Arab street. But that is a completely different space.
well, I mean, public opinion is one side. Then
Yeah.
there is the social media opinion, which you
Yeah.
would agree with me that even the social media opinion in India does not really represent either what the Indian government is saying or what people who follow the situation, who are educated about the situation, would actually say either.
Yeah. And coming back to Operation Sindoor, because Turkey, Azerbaijan, and many other countries openly, supported Pakistan, then Prime Minister Modi also recently went to Cyprus. How do you think that, what is the future of India-Turkish alliances?
Well, the relationship with Turkey has been complex for a very long time. And one part of it is Turkey's very close relationship with Pakistan, one part of it, and particularly the Turkish military's very close relationship with the Pakistani military. That has been one part of it. Let's also remember that India took a very strong position in favor of Cyprus way back in the 1970s, which also created its own problems with Turkey when we spoke about the need for the occupying forces to move out. The truth is, India and Turkey have as I said, when we get into the geopolitical situation, it's a lot more complex. When it comes to the bilateral situation, there are so many reasons for India and Turkey to work together. They are two powerhouses in their own regions. At a certain level. I mean, regardless of what you think of Turkish policy towards its neighbors, the fact that it has influence in its neighborhood and beyond can be easily gauged by the number of peace processes Turkey has been a part of, including the Ukraine-Russia grain initiative was actually done by was done in Turkey. So there are a lot of reasons for India and Turkey to work together, whether it's the trade, whether it's the tourism, whether it's the fact that they have a certain kind of worldview in common. But it has become an extremely fraught relationship. One had thought that first, in the last few years, if you remember, when President Erdogan came to India, Prime Minister Modi and he met, they embraced, one felt that there was a reset in the making. But that didn't happen. After that, we've seen even when the Turkish earthquake happened and Prime Minister Modi sent Indian forces to help with the earthquake, there seemed to be another chance for a reset, and that hasn't really worked out. I think at the end of the day, eventually we will have to, if we want to move forward, we'll have to look beyond Turkey's relations with other countries and India's relations with other countries. You mentioned the Prime Minister's visit to Cyprus. There's a lot, there's a historic relationship with Cyprus. If we start looking at visits and if we start looking at various Indian foreign policy initiatives as just a way of sticking a finger in or poking somebody else, I think that would be a disservice to India's own stature in the world. I think we have to look at India's policies towards these countries in terms of what we have in common, what we've had in common, and what we can have. There's another part to this feeling that there is a sort of Turkish, Pakistan, Azerbaijani kind of link up against India, which I think we're not looking at. And that is the fight inside the OIC for the leadership of the Islamic world, if you like to call it. I mean, as I said, I myself find it difficult to believe that there is this kind of commonality on the basis of faith, because Arab countries, for example, all have the same faith, but they're not one country. They all speak the same language, but they're not one country. So there is something to be said about the reason why these are all separate nations with their own nationalisms. But there is a kind of tussle for a sort of leadership of that world. The original traditional leadership has always been with, say, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, the Gulf countries in a sense. And more recently, we have seen the more populated countries like Turkey, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and Malaysia actually countering that. So sometimes India does get caught in that crossfire as well. And I think in those situations, we need to separate them from the situations where India's interests themselves are being hurt.
And my last question to you, ma'am, is that how, because a very important part of all this conflict is also the maritime route, be it the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea or the Mediterranean Sea. And they have a history of being colonized by various actors. They have a history of attacks. Just as, for example, Houthis are trying to challenge the status quo of the Red Sea. Then the hypothetical scenario building where Strait of Hormuz might be closed, though it's not sustainable. But when we talk about India's maritime policy as a part of its foreign policy in the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and all of these till the Mediterranean Sea, IMEC is one part of it. But we don't know what's the future of it. But how do you see India could engage more in its maritime policy with all the conflicts going around?
Well, let's be clear again. This is historical. India's maritime relations, whether it's with the coasts of Africa, whether it's Arabia, whether it has been further out like Greece, they're all intricately linked with the sea routes. In fact, when the IMEC started, and you look at the idea that India is, building a corridor between India and the UAE, actually that's been happening for centuries. So you have to figure out what is the value add from an initiative like that. I would say that to begin with, let's just talk about the IMEC. The IMEC was a very, very, sort of enthusiastically launched initiative in September 2023. The plan was that there would be this initiative that would string together ports in India, in the UAE, then move over a railway line to Saudi Arabia, go up to Jordan, then have a kind of trade route across Israel that would lead to the Haifa port. And then from there into Europe through either Greece, the Piraeus port, or another one, through Italy, Trieste, and then through France and Marseille. So there was this kind of real enthusiasm about this happening. However, Haifa in Israel became a kind of linchpin. And when October 7th happened, a big pause was put on this project as a result of that. Now, I think because there was this conflict, many of us assumed that that was the reason why IMEC was being held up. But it hasn't really been convincingly thought through in many respects. To begin with, the first one being the added cost of this kind of a project, which involves hybrid transportation. So ship, rail, maybe even bus at places, then ship, then rail, that kind of cost versus what we have right now through the Suez Canal or the Red Sea it has not yet been worked out whether it is actually cost effective. The second is the fact that we also have rail routes in West Asia which haven't been sort of sustainable for a very long time. A lot of it is through the desert. The third part was this idea that with this initiative, we were somehow becoming exclusive. That if it was India, West Asia, and Europe, and of course the US, which was quarterbacking the movement, involved, then somehow the idea was we were cutting out China. But China has very close ties with West Asian countries and has built some of these railway lines. So would we have to build our own just in order to cut China out, or cutting out Iran? Again, this is a problem because we, as I said, we have been discussing the INSTC through Iran, or cutting out Egypt, which is a very close friend of India's and has been saying for a while now, well, if Haifa doesn't work, think about another port alignment. Think about using Egypt. So what we ended up seeing with IMEC was, because of the conflict, we haven't really discussed the rest. But there are all these other loose ends that have not been discussed. And when it comes to India's maritime route for cargo, which of course is much cheaper, and whether it is the Straits of Hormuz, or whether it is the Red Sea, or whether it is, these are all places that areas that India has traditionally always traded with. And you were talking about the colonization. Remember, Nehru actually suggested support for Egypt during the Suez Canal crisis, and even helped with some airplanes, I think, at the time. So there is a historical relationship which needs to be sort of found in a sense. I think also with Europe, similarly, I think there's a need to understand how we can better cooperate with them. But I do think that for the foreseeable future, and I'm being a little pessimistic here, simply because we don't yet know what the end game for Israel and Gaza is going to be. If that end game does not end with a sovereign Palestinian state, which at this point does not seem at all likely, Israel has in its parliament rejected the idea, are any of the Arab countries going to be able to work with Israel again? As you pointed out, the street is very strong. There's a very strong opinion on this. If that is the case, then how long can India afford to keep this idea in abeyance, waiting for that conflict to end and for all of these countries to be able to work together? So I think all of these, even the route with Iran for the moment is under a cloud. Chabahar is under a cloud because America is coming up with new sanctions over there. INSTC is under a cloud because of trade with Russia, as well as the actual Israel-Iran conflict as well. So, given all of these conflicts that are right now, gripping the world and gripping the region in particular, I think a lot of our planning has to be on the drawing board, has to be tabletop for the moment, with the idea that there will be a time of stability. There will be a time when India can go forward with some of these plans.
I completely believe that Trump has no idea what is IMEC. And I am completely sure that because he believes that Biden was a clone, he's not going to, because the main funding is coming from supposedly from US, and I'm not sure that Trump knows that there was something.
Actually, that's the biggest problem about IMEC, that nobody actually knows who is funding it. There was a plan for the G7, it's called PGII, to fund it, but it hasn't moved.
Yeah, it hasn't. And I'm pretty sure Trump is not going to invest one penny. In fact, he would ask money out of it.
Yeah, well, that makes it more difficult.
Yeah. But most of the students over here are in their 20s. And during this conversation, we have gone back to history so many times, like be it Gandhi, Nehru, or the historical relations. Why do you think the students, I'm not patronizing, I'm just giving a point of view. Why should they study history more during the current times, which is much more conflictual than what they have not seen?
I think to begin with, to understand that none of the issues we are grappling with today have easy answers in the immediate past. Does history begin when Hamas attacked Israel, or when Israel attacked Gaza in the last few years? No, it doesn't. History begins long before, and centuries before, if you believe some of the ideas. There are others that, there are other conflicts that also have similar underpinnings. The second thing I think one needs to understand is that India's relations today, and Prime Minister Modi has done a huge amount of work in terms of his relationship with this region. I think someone was counting that he has been to the UAE maybe 6 or 7 times in his tenure. That's huge. I don't think any other prime minister has done that. With Saudi Arabia as well, he has built relations. He was in Saudi Arabia, in fact, the day of the Pahalgam terror attacks. And with each of these other countries, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman. But in each of those visits, if you recall, whether it was the MEA statements, whether it was the Prime Minister's own statements, whether it was the other side statements, there was a reference to how India and those countries had interacted in ancient times, or in the last 20 years, or the last 30 years, or since the non-aligned movement. So I do think that there is a thread over there that you can't get away from. Eventually, if we were only to go by relationships that help us in the exact present, we wouldn't have too many. It would just be a buy or sell relationship. What is it that gives you that extra amount of engagement? And that is the history. And it's necessary to understand the history. There are a couple of great writers. And I would always say, there are a number of Indian writers, even contemporary ones, that you should follow. My colleague Stanley Johnny, who has written a couple of books, one on ISIS, of course, but also a new one called Original Sin, which is about the region and his travels through the region. Ambassador Talmiz Ahmed, who has written a book called West Asia at War. P.R. Kumaraswamy from JNU, who produces a volume on West Asia every year. Those are all very important books because they tell the story from India's perspective, and why you need to know about what our relationship with Iran was, which maybe today our bilateral trade is a few billion. But the relationship goes back to so much more.
Yeah. And Navodita is asking a simple question, which is that do you think that UAE will be or can be regarded as a stepping stone for India to deepen its ties with the Gulf countries?
I think UAE has taken on a new role in the Gulf under MBZ, as everyone calls him, Mohammed bin Zayed, and is looking to, in a sense, there's even a small competition with Saudi Arabia in terms of pitching itself as the modern face of the Gulf. And definitely, I think India and the UAE have improved their relations, and the UAE, in a sense, creates an environment. One must also remember that the UAE itself is pitched against some of its neighbors. Its tensions with Iran were far more. In fact, after Saudi Arabia and Iran, restarted their ties and exchanged ambassadors, they've actually had a closer relationship now. But the UAE and Iran have a lot of misgivings. The UAE and Qatar, if you remember those years of the boycott, that also. It's a package. I think it's important, as I said, to see each of these relationships for the richness that they have bilaterally. And then to try and work a framework where we have shared values, we have common values, and we want to go forward on certain common projects without necessarily having the same expectations from them, because this is now a much more complex world given all these conflicts.
Yeah. And Anurag is asking that if you compare India's relation with West Asia, Middle East versus China's relation, like, for example, most of the IMEC countries are part of DRI. So how does India figure out or jostle, or is the entire idea of India-China rivalry American lobby attempt?
That's why you need to study history.
Yeah.
Because, the Indian relationship is a much more richer cultural relationship. When it comes to China, these countries do have very close ties. They sell a lot of their energy to a country like China that's, has a higher requirement. They also, for example, Iran has brought China in to run an entire railway project, infrastructure project, which Iran could not have funded on its own. So in that sense, there is the need for each of these countries. I don't think these countries have the same problem that perhaps we have seen in South Asia or Central Asia, which is the debt trapping.
Yeah.
And they know where what they are getting into, in a sense, in this relationship. I don't think that we are actually competing or even clashing in West Asia when it comes to, and neither side is actually asking West Asian countries to side with one side or the other. By the way, I always do make the point of saying West Asia simply because the concept of the Middle East, even if people in the Middle East use it, essentially refers to a map of the world that we don't necessarily recognize. If you put a map of the world over there, it's not east of us.
Yeah.
It is west of us.
Yeah.
And there is a reason why India, propagated the idea of Wana rather than Mina, which is the Western world calls it Middle East and Northern Africa, and we call it West Asia and Northern Africa. But of course, we mean very much the same areas.
Yeah. No, I chose it specifically because of the algorithm.
Correct.
That's the algorithm and the data.
IMEC.
IMEC.
Is also the same.
Yeah. So with this, I would like to really thank you, ma'am, for the privilege of your time. And we had only asked for 40 minutes, but we went ahead with that. And so thank you for being so gracious. Those who joined late could watch the entire session on YouTube, which will be uploaded in 2 or 3 days. And we have dealt with most of the questions that were asked by the scholars today. And with this, for a very, very long time, you had been, and you have been, and you continue to be one of the role models when it comes to journalism. And I remember that every time, whenever your analysis piece used to come, especially the one on Chabahar that came, and it was huge. That, cut out copies of it and make notes and, underline it. Nice. So that was the kind of,
even for your students, I do try very hard with my weekly YouTube show called Worldview to make point form analysis so that, at least you understand where India stands And what is in India's benefit and what is India's loss?
Yeah. So with this, thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you so much for the privilege of your time.